Hello, I'm Brooke Goldstein and welcome to Outspoken. Today we have a very important episode. We are focusing on the Claims Conference. The Claims Conference is a New York-based nonprofit. It is the entity responsible for negotiating, mainly with the German government, to collect restitution money and to recover stolen property on behalf of Holocaust survivors and their heirs. Now, the Claims Conference is supposed to take the money it gets from Germany and other governments and hold that money in trust and then give that money away to Holocaust survivors to pay for things like food, medical needs, housing, and other basic necessities. Instead, only a fraction of the assets looted from Holocaust victims and paid out to the Claims Conference have been returned to their rightful owners. Rather, the Claims Conference has been funding what it calls education, documentation, and research to the tune of millions of dollars, acting like they have no legal or moral accountability to assist survivors to the best of the Claims Conference's abilities. Spending the money with discretion as though it's theirs, which it's not. Equally as disturbing, after making it almost impossible for Holocaust survivors and their heirs to claim the properties it recovered from East Germany, the Claims Conference turned around and sold some of those properties, amassing a fortune that wasn't theirs. In the meantime, half of all Holocaust survivors around the world live in poverty. Here in America, 1/3 of Holocaust survivors live at or below the poverty line. That's 61% of the 100,000 survivors left in the United States that are barely getting by, hardly able to pay their medical bills, their rent, living in dire conditions without even the ability to feed themselves wholesome, nutritious meals. It has been estimated that the Claims Conference has spent over $250 million on things entirely unrelated to survivor care, like the production of obscure films, research on North African Jewry, the digitization of photographs, and Holocaust education for students and teachers. Don't get me wrong, these are all worthy initiatives, but the Claims Conference is not a film production company. It's not a generalized grant-making institution. It is the trustee for funds and property that belong to Holocaust survivors and their heirs. What kind of message are we broadcasting to those students the Claims Conference is sending on trips to Israel and Poland to commemorate the Holocaust, while at the same time thousands of survivors are struggling to make ends meet and, as you will hear in this program, haggling with the Claims Conference to receive the money they desperately need to supplement their care? How humiliating, how disgraceful. And therein lies the controversy. Grants to the Anti-Defamation League for publishing handbooks, cash for the Jewish Agency for weekend seminars for adults. These organizations don't need the money. They have their own fundraising operations, and they certainly shouldn't be taking money directly out of the pockets of Holocaust survivors that do need it. And then there are the appalling scandals that have plagued the organization. The 16-year, $57 million fraud that was orchestrated by Claims Conference employees, exposing the total lack of proper governance and management. The $700,000 that was reportedly funneled to a consultant friend of then Claims Conference President Israel Singer. The Knesset investigation of the Claims Conference for its failure to disclose the details of East German properties it had obtained. And the alleged intimidation of its critics. The reported threatening of editors and journalists, as well as agency executives who dare criticize the Claims Conference's policies. What is this, the Jewish mafia? Researching for this program, I spoke with nonprofits that aid Holocaust survivors and which receive funding from the Claims Conference. None of them were prepared to speak on camera about their experiences out of fear that they would risk losing their funding. One of them, however, agreed to give me an anonymous quote, which reads as follows. Every year, the Claims Conference gives more and more money for educational purposes when the needs of survivors are so dire and they are dying out without adequate help. The German home health care program is a total scam because it does not take into account the physical conditions of Holocaust survivors. Survivors are capped at 40 hours per week, leaving them without help on several days. Recently, one survivor fell on the floor and waited in agonizing pain until her aid came 2.5 hours later. The Claims Conference falsely advertises unlimited increases in home care hours, which is a lie. And they all but eliminated cash assistance for any other needs, medical, food, housing, burial. It is a shunda. End of quote. The British Board of Jewish Deputies has called out the Claims Conference for its unethical behavior. Holocaust survivors have testified before congressional committees on the issue. The Holocaust Survivors Foundation, an organization composed of elected leaders of survivor groups, even wrote a letter to the New York Attorney General's office calling for an investigation into the Claims Conference misuse of funds, all to no avail. Now, I invited the Claims Conference to come on the program to explain themselves, but they refused to appear, treating the issue with the same type of indifference and arrogance that has characterized their work. Folks, we have so little time left to make this right. I am horrified to know that after suffering through humanity's darkest period, the Jewish community and the Attorney General's office is standing by as survivors continue to suffer needlessly while millions of dollars remain in the coffers of the Claims Conference. I implore everyone watching today, call up the New York Attorney General's office and demand they ensure the Claims Conference operates with transparency and accountability that Holocaust survivors deserve and the law mandates. Samuel J. Dubbin is a principal in the law firm of Dubbin & Kravitz. He is a former Clinton administration department official. He was the special assistant to Attorney General Janet Reno and a deputy assistant attorney general in the DOJ in the mid-90s. Sam's law firm was one of 3 that successfully represented Hungarian Holocaust survivors seeking restitution and an accounting against the U.S. government in the Hungarian gold train case, which settled for $25.5 million in 2005 after nearly 5 years of litigation. Sam's firm provides a variety of legal services to Holocaust survivors and the heirs of Holocaust victims, including advising Jewish families on the recovery of Nazi-looted art. He has testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Committee, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and U.S. Judiciary subcommittees on the right of Holocaust survivors to recovery of unpaid insurance policies. He assisted the Senate Select Committee on Aging and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs in organizing landmark congressional hearings on the healthcare needs of Holocaust survivors in the U.S. and around the world. Sam serves as counsel to the Holocaust Survivors Foundation USA, which is a national coalition of grassroots survivor leaders representing 20 states. He has been honored by the Jewish Museum of Florida, the University of Miami Law School, and the Blue Card Foundation here in New York for his outstanding work on behalf of the survivor community. Sam joins us here in studio today all the way from Florida. Sam, thank you so much for coming to speak to us about this very important topic. Clearly, you are qualified. You work directly with the survivor community. Could you tell us, in sum, what is the issue here with the Claims Conference?
The survivor's position, after years of dealing with the Claims Conference and the German government and attempting to get restitution of their looted assets and experiencing the hardships and tragedies of survivors aging and being in poverty, is that the existing system does not work and has not ever worked, despite the fact that the Claims Conference has been in charge of Holocaust issues and Holocaust restitution since the end of the war. Today, in the year 2018, half of all Holocaust survivors in the United States and around the world live in or near poverty, and they do not come close to having the necessary care they need: home care, medical care, dental care, hearing aids, eyeglasses, wheelchairs, food, nutrition.
So you have a claims conference, which basically serves as the trustee, right, for funds that are given to it from Germany.
Basically, yes.
And they have, according to their 2016 990, at least $300 million right now in net assets. And yet you have Holocaust survivors around the world that are living at or near the poverty line. So the problem is they're not giving out the money.
That's one of the problems, and one of the problems that survivors have pointed out, for a couple of decades now, is that this claims conference maintained large reserves of funds for whatever future needs they, harbored while survivors were dying for lack of care. And that's a fact.
So they're making grants to other organizations.
So there are two basic sources of funding that the claims conference utilizes. Mm-hmm. The first source comes from Jewish properties in Eastern Europe that were not restituted after the war. Germany passed a law to allow those to be returned to the owners in 1990, and the claims conference made claims to thousands of those properties that the actual heirs and the actual survivors, missed the ridiculous 2-year deadline that Germany set. Mm-hmm. And when the claims conference made those applications, instead of holding it as a trustee for the actual heirs, the claims conference took the position years later that when an heir came forward, the actual heir, the actual survivor who owned the property, the claims conference said, no, we own that. We're not holding it as a trustee, it's ours.
So the German government gave properties to the claims conference to hold for people who had been robbed of their properties by the Nazis. And if they didn't come and report within 2 years, the claims conference said they lost the right to come. And then they took it as their own?
Yes. And there was a huge outcry from the survivors and the heirs periodically over the years. And so the claims conference would grudgingly say, okay, we're going to establish a goodwill fund, okay? Meaning we're going to give some of this money to some of these heirs. But over time, it was a very difficult process, and a small number of heirs were able to recover some of their funds. They started that in 1998. Mm-hmm. They did it again in 2003, 2004. But again, the process was very opaque and very difficult to navigate. So over time, what the claims conference was able to do was amass billions of dollars. Exactly how many, I can't say, but it's been at least $2 billion, maybe more, that it considers its money to dispense how it wishes.
But it's not its money. It's holding the money in trust for
the
Holocaust survivors and the heirs. Izzy Lieber of the Jerusalem Post wrote an article saying that by the time that they were allowing Holocaust survivors and their heirs to actually claim German property, that it was, quote, sold on the open market by the claims conference, and that in 2013, there was actually a court case in Germany, correct? And the court ruled against the claims conference position.
Correct.
Saying that they were wrong for the past 25 years, and that, in fact, it's not their property, it's the property of Holocaust survivors.
And yet they had amassed, billions of dollars, calling themselves the, quote, largest Jewish philanthropy in the world. Now, my view of philanthropy is it's either money you give out of your own pocket or money that you raise from others. It's not money that you acquire by a legal trickery, with the property of Holocaust victims. But that particular problem of the East German properties was reviewed by the British Board of Jewish Deputies.
Right.
And,
so it influenced a report, actually, that the Board of Deputies commissioned in the UK on the claims conference. And what did it show us?
Jeffrey Gruder, who's a barrister in England, did the independent report, and he said, quote, the claims conference refused to publish or disclose the details of heirless properties it recovered or claimed, both before and after the deadline set by Germany to claim the property in 1993. And that when pressured to provide information, it did so in a manner that made it virtually impossible for heirs to identify or claim their assets. Now, that was a report he did about in 2010. After that, there was another outcry by the heirs, and then the claims conference set up what they called the Late Applicants Fund, where, again, you had to waive your rights before you can even apply to it, and they would not promise, what level of property would be given back. But it allowed the claims conference to basically be the financial kings of the Jewish world, because they had a lot of money to give out. And one of the ways that they've amassed a tremendous amount of influence is by providing money to Jewish organizations worldwide,
so
without regard to whether or not it was for the survivors.
If they're making grants to Holocaust museums and for Holocaust education, and they're giving money. I think the Anti-Defamation League is a recipient. What's wrong with that?
It's not their money, number one. Number two, as long as there are Holocaust survivors who are in desperate need of medicine, food, home care, dental care. I mean, if the dental health of Holocaust survivors is terrible. I mean, with the malnutrition and the beatings and the starvation that they experienced in the camps, almost every survivor I know has tens of thousands of dollars of dental bills. Germany should be paying for that directly, but if the claims conference is going to be dispensing money, why in the world would they give the Anti-Defamation League money for education when a Holocaust survivor can't get their teeth fixed? Now, some of that money was used by the claims conference to provide for care, through the Jewish Family Services around the country.
But it's not enough. I mean, I went and I spoke to leaders in the Jewish community professionals who work for these type of Jewish community organizations, and the answer was always the same. We don't have enough money. We apply for a grant, it could be $6 million. We only get 1/3 of that when we can prove the needs of Holocaust survivors. And on top of that, there's so many strings attached to the money that they can't use it to fund the types of basic needs that Holocaust survivors, need to live a dignified life. So the question is, the claims conference is a 501c3. I mentioned they do file a 990. Where is the board? Where is the board of directors on this? Where is the oversight? Where is the audit? Has any of this been done?
Well, in the mid-2000s, the audits of their assets were pulled back as being inaccurate by Ernst & Young did it, did the reports, and they were admitted to be improper.
Who admitted that?
Ernst & Young and the claims conference did in a memo saying, we've got to revisit all of these issues. But to the satisfaction of the survivors, there's still never been a public accounting of how much money was recovered through the German properties and how it was all spent. And what's left. And what's left.
Well, we see from the 990 what they're claiming to be left. But, every year they're on this press junket and they advertise, we negotiated this year X million dollars with the German government. Is there an accounting of exactly how that money is being spent? How much is for overhead? How much goes to administration? How it's being spent by the third-party organizations that they give it to? I mean, did they not amend their bylaws to allow them to make grants to organizations that don't have any direct involvement in providing survivor needs? Doesn't that defeat the whole purpose?
You're absolutely right, Brooke. That's after the German restitution law of 1990 was passed, setting the deadline in 1992, and the claims conference set up a real estate company to make all these claims. It amended its bylaws in 1994, and instead of being limited to providing care and maintenance and assistance for victims of the Holocaust, it authorized spending money on research, education, and documentation. And that's always been the rationale for giving money to groups like B'nai B'rith, the World Jewish Congress, Anti-Defamation League.
But the thought that, the ADL or even the World Jewish Congress, organizations that I have, great amount of respect for, they don't have any problems fundraising. They're not short of money. And yet when you think of Holocaust survivors literally living at or below the poverty line today in New York, I think the stats are something like 40% of the Holocaust survivors in New York at or beneath the poverty line can't even afford food, can't afford glasses, can't afford their own medical care. What are they doing making these grants?
This is the reason that the Holocaust Survivors Foundation USA formed itself among survivor leaders from around the country because of frustration over the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, and the failure of the so-called restitution enterprise, up to that point, and the growing poverty and need among survivors that simply wasn't being met. To be a national advocate.
Talk about that. So your client is the Holocaust Survivors Foundation USA.
That's correct.
Correct. And you wrote a letter, or the foundation wrote a letter to the Attorney General, asking the Attorney General of New York, of the state of New York, to look into what is going on. So we have Holocaust survivors who should be the recipients of this money, who the claims conference is holding money for as the trustee, appealing to the New York Attorney General's office saying, we're not getting the money, what is going on? And you submitted, or they submitted this letter, and what was the response?
Well, the letter was very detailed and covered a lot of the issues that have been causing damage to the survivor community, and it was precipitated. The proximate cause of the letter was the $57 million fraud that was perpetrated by claims conference employees working, colluding with other criminals, diverting money from funds earmarked by Germany for survivors. This was a fraud that took place over a 16-year period between the mid-90s and 2010 before it was discovered.
Well, tell me about this fraud. What exactly was happening? $57 million fraudulently stolen.
There was the insiders in the claims conference were working with runners and marks who were filling out fraudulent applications for pensions, and so they would lie about the year they were born. They would lie about the place they were born, and so for a $5,000 payment that was made, the insider in the claims conference would get $1,500. The runner would get $500. The person filling out the application would get several $100s. So they split the money. The fact that this went on without abatement inside an organization,
15 years,
and this is the organization that the Jewish community, as you say, has allowed to be the so-called sole representative of the survivor community. They get recognized by the German government, in Congress, everywhere you go. It's like the claims conference is taking care of the problems. Well, they were completely derelict in their responsibilities. And imagine, with the so-called billions of dollars that they've been negotiating here, they let this, that they allowed this kind of a fraud that, caused tremendous damage to, the needs of survivors. And so when then the ombudsman of the claims conference, did they even allowed their own insider to do the analysis of what went wrong.
Did they ever get the money back?
It would be very difficult to get the money back from some of these poor people who were the ones getting it. But some of the money was restituted from the claims conference employees. But the damage was not because the damage was.
So they're going to say, well, yes, that's in the past. We're looking towards the future. That's actually what they did say when I called them. Say, well, we don't want to talk about it. That's in the past. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say what the Holocaust survivors are saying, which is that if you re-elect the same board of directors unanimously, if you keep the same management in place that allowed this fraud to be perpetrated under their noses for 16 years without noticing it, you shouldn't remain in control of an organization of this
importance. So the board members remain the same. There has been no clearing of house, and almost every single, well, I don't know if it's every single, but a lot of the organizations whose representatives do serve on the board of the claims conference are also recipients of claims conference grants. So there is a potential conflict of interest there. Now, you organized hearings in Congress, and outspoken member of Congress, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, came out in 2014 and did something very brave. She actually said that she has heard, and this is a quote, repeatedly concerns from some of my constituents regarding the failure, the deception, the lies of the claims conference, and how though this is intended to help survivors receive fair compensation, it has been an impediment in the process. Now, my understanding was her entire testimony, they tried to stop it.
Well, Congresswoman Ros-Lehtinen, along with Ted Deutsch, a representative from South Florida, and Congressman Rohrabacher and Engel, organized these hearings. It was done at the initiation of the Holocaust Survivors Foundation and their advocates to document the unmet needs of Holocaust survivors and their poverty status. And how are they doing? And it was extremely important. It was, the Senate had done one in January of that year, then the House did this in September 2014, and it was chilling documentation of the poverty among survivors, the lack of funding to take care of their basic needs. When you look at, for example, at the time the claims conference in Germany had announced that there was going to be $200 million in home care funding, for example, to cover 67,000 survivors. Well, if you do the math and you divide the $200 million by 67,000 survivors, that yielded a total of about $3,500 per survivor.
Per year.
Per year.
That's
And
nothing.
that covers
That's a
10
shame.
weeks of home care. So here the
Wow.
claims conference in Germany were touting their great accomplishments, but if you picked up the, if you looked under the rock, you could tell that this was, deceptively, optimistic when in fact it left people without tremendous amount of care. So those are the kinds of revelations that came out of these hearings. And the claims conference tried to stop Ms. Ross-Leitonen from having these hearings because they didn't want to have the fundamental problems.
How did they try to stop her? I have to say my experience is a lot of people are intimidated to speak about the claims conference because they do receive grants even though they are lacking and they don't want to jeopardize their grants. Obviously the claims conference will advertise that they're the #1 largest Jewish philanthropy in the world, but that is essentially the problem. Their mission should not be to hand out money that isn't theirs to random organizations. And they you have reported, and it was mentioned in the letter that the Holocaust Survivors Foundation USA submitted to the Attorney General's office, that there is an element of intimidation. Intimidation of journalists, intimidation of Holocaust survivors, apparently, reportedly. Is that true?
Well, it is true. And I'll read you as an example of a testimony of Esther Finder. She's a second-generation leader. She was an official delegate of the United States government to the Prague conference in 2009 and 2013 that was to deal with restitution, and eventually they were supposed to deal with the health care and poverty needs of survivors. And her report, she said, and it's worth me reading this if you don't mind, when I did my research on the needs of aging survivors, I contacted social service agencies all over the United States. Nobody had anything nice to say about the claims conference or its system of distributing funds, but they would not speak with me on the record. They expressed the same frustration. Though they are not getting sufficient funds from the claims conference to adequately care for the survivors, they would not speak publicly for fear of retribution. They did not want to lose that little bit of funding they were getting. They were intimidated and would only speak with me, quote, off the record.
I mean, it just is terribly depressing that having survived the Holocaust, coming to America, not being able to trust the entity that was set up to recover monies for you. And on top of it, if you speak out and you talk to journalists, or if you want to appear on a program about the issue, which we should all be talking about, this is a community issue, these are the health of our survivors, you feel intimidated to do so. I mean, this to me is an element of abuse on top of abuse.
I can tell you from firsthand experience, after the German court made that decision in 2013, holding that the claims conference indeed should be treated as a trustee and not as the owner of the property, I was interviewed by the Jewish Week. They did a story, documenting, quoting not just me but others who had experience in the field, and they were forced to take that article off of their website. You couldn't find it there today, although I can show you a copy of it. And I was told that they were, badgered by the claims conference to change that story, even though there wasn't one inaccuracy in the story.
Well, we're not going to be intimidated to talk about these issues openly because #1, our responsibility is to the survivor community and to truth. And we are a little bit short on time, Sam. Thank you so much for coming to join us. But if you were to leave our audience with one thought, what can we do now going forward? So Izzy Lieber, for example, said that we should at least consider a temporary freezing of the projects that don't go towards helping survivors' needs directly. What do you suggest?
$18 million a year goes to non-survivor projects.
$18 million a year.
And that would pay for a lot of dental care, a lot of food, a lot of medicine that survivors, a lot of home care that survivors are not getting. But even that understates the problem dramatically, because if you look at the $480 million they now claim that they got for 2018 for home care, and you do the math there, that only pays for 25 weeks of home care a year. And that's after 10 years of what Stuart Eisenstadt calls very difficult negotiations. Well, the negotiations shouldn't be difficult, and Germany should not be able to hide behind the claims conference. And the claims conference should not act as a front for Germany.
Right.
And saying,
if Germany's not giving enough money, then don't advertise that this is a success.
The Congress, after those hearings we had in 2016, passed resolutions calling on Germany to pay for all of the survivors' needs, period. End of story. Have a direct system administered by the U.S. government similar to Medicare, where the survivors' needs are taken care of. There's no rationing. There's no picking and choosing among which community gets more money if you're a survivor.
Strings attached to the grants and so forth.
Stovepipes and funding, through different, avenues that people don't understand. Just have Germany pay the bill. So the Jewish community needs to speak out about the fact that their so-called leaders, okay,
Right.
not only the organizations who are part of the claims conference and the Jewish federations and the family services who are getting that money, they need to speak out and say, it's time for Germany to just pay these bills and let us do our job as medical professionals, helping survivors. Let Germany pay for it. Let's get the organizations and the middlemen out of the picture.
Absolutely. Sam, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. We are joined by a very compelling panel. Dr. Barbara Paris is the Director of Geriatric Medicine and the Vice Chair of the Department of Medicine at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn, New York. Dr. Paris has always been interested in the survivor population, some of whom are also her family. As Brooklyn serves the largest community of survivors outside of Israel, a large part of Dr. Paris's work is the provision of medical services to the survivor population. Zahava Stessel is a survivor of Auschwitz, as was her recently deceased husband. She is a patient of Dr. Paris's, who receives assistance from the Claims Conference and from self-help. She came to the United States in the mid-1950s. Naomi Vilko is a board-certified psychiatrist with over 30 years of experience and an expertise in the treatment of trauma, depression, and anxiety disorders. She is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Both of her parents survived concentration camps, her mother a survivor of Auschwitz as well as a slave labor camp, and her father survived 5 concentration camps and 5 death marches. She has treated several survivors and has a specialty in post-traumatic stress disorder and the psychological trauma effects on the second-generation children of survivors. Ladies, welcome to Outspoken. Thank you so much for taking the time to come join us. We are deeply appreciative. Zahava, I'd like to start with you. As a survivor, could you tell us how the community finds out about what services are out there to support your medical and other needs?
From other survivors, because there is no literature, no newspaper to let us know. And occasionally in the newspapers we find something that say they're helping the survivors, but very little in the general newspaper. So we find out from each other, one survivor from the other, and we don't have the full picture even, because it's hard. Some survivors believe that it's private what they're getting. They don't want to tell the whole story, so we have to find out on our own way. So,
but how about, for example, self-help? I know that you've worked a little bit. You have a social worker. Do they not tell you what your benefits, what you're entitled to?
It's changing. Now I feel a little bit better, because before that till I find the self-help that we can apply, it was also to find where to go. It's also from other survivors. We can but at that time we didn't even have we have a social worker, but didn't deal so much just what we have not. What we really need.
So there's no organized communal outreach to the survivors, even here in New York, about what's available to you. And what is the process like in terms of applying for help? You do receive some help, correct?
Yes, yes.
And what was the process like in terms of applying for that?
First we had to find the agency. We find the agency, and then the agency interviewed us and find out that we are Auschwitz survivors. It was me and my husband, and then when we can get some help. And then we were offered I could have home attendant, home aid, and this is the way we were told that we can have it.
So you receive home aid. But how about expenses, continuous expenses, monthly expenses for the upkeep of your home, for example?
This even never entered, all these years, never entered in our mind that we can ask something. We were happy with getting the home aid, but slowly now we're realizing that it's get harder to keep up the payment of our home.
So you have
and this
taxes, for example,
The
annual taxes. Are you able to
taxes.
recover those? Are you getting any help for that?
No, and finally I asked the social worker, which now, up till now, the social worker, we didn't even know we had a social worker. Now we know we have, so I asked him, and he said, unfortunately, this recurring expenses not covered,
So
only
recurring-
one time.
So the position then of the claims conference vis-a-vis you, apparently, as I
Yes.
understand, is that recurring expenses for the upkeep of your home, to live at home, are not covered.
No,
How about something like dental, when you go to the dentist, what
Dental
happens?
would be covered, but
The full amount?
If probably even the full amount, but the procedure, you have to go to the dentist, and the dentist fill out a form. If he's kind and can do it, not every dentist deal with it, but if find a nice dentist, he will fill out the form, like I needed dental work, and it was about $900, and filled out the form.
And what did you receive when it was a $900
and
expense?
I presented the claim to my social worker in self-help, and after a few months, I received my dentist received half of the amount.
Half the amount.
Half of the amount.
Dr. Paris, is this common, these stories that you're hearing?
Yes, but I want to start by saying that the social worker from self-help never, ever communicate with me about my patients. Never call me, how can we help your patient? I never, I could never get their name. I used to call many times and say, I want to speak to the social worker. What can my patient, we as the doctor taking care of these patients, they don't reach out to us in any way to tell us what they see as the patient's needs from the social work point of view, or how we can help get these needs.
These are social workers from entities that were receiving grants also from the claims conference.
Yes. So, the biggest issue is home care. Mrs. Stessel is 88 years old. She lives alone. Her children do not live in New York. So she has to negotiate all of this on her own. Her taxes, her dental bills, all the receipts. I just want to share with you what it takes to even get an application. So here's a checklist from one of the organizations that gets some funding from the claims conference. So first you need a government-issued ID. Well, that's either a passport, a Medicaid card, or a driver's license. A significant number of our patients have none of those. So
Right off the bat, they're not eligible.
You're striked out.
Wow.
Your tax papers, things need to be notarized. How is a patient who's 88 years old, maybe, I brought you my star patient. Most of my patients have visual problems, mobility problems. How are they going to go and get something notarized?
So you find that the needs, that they have the basic medical needs, okay, which you can describe, they're not being met by
No.
the claims conference? How about Medicare? How about Medicaid?
So, when I have a patient who has Medicaid, that's a gold mine for me, and I can take a deep breath because I know they're going to get what they need. Because Medicaid in New York is still quite generous, even though it's become more restrictive. And when you need a home attendant, you can apply for one and you can get one. So, for example, I have a patient who has 24-hour home care, but she is up at night for various medical reasons, and she's screaming, having night terrors from the Holocaust, blood sugar is going different ways, and she gets out of bed. And a Medicaid home attendant that's there for 24 hours can only get up 3 times a night by law, because they have to sleep, because they have to take care of the patient. So there's such a thing called split shift, which is really very challenging to get. So we ask the survivors to get a few hours from this claims conference or from the German government to supplement the Medicaid.
Right.
So in the interim of my sending these letters and explaining the situation, 2 months go by and this patient breaks her hip and falls and is
While
in
she
nursing.
was waiting for
waiting
claims
2
conference
months,
money.
waiting for that.
And the process
few
of
hours.
application, how much paperwork is involved?
It's speaking, I can quote from a lawyer, son of a patient,
Right.
who basically said it's formalistic, bureaucratic, and nearly impossible to negotiate even as a lawyer's son.
Wow. Naomi,
Yeah, I would. I completely agree, and I wish my mother had a doctor like you. So my mother is going to be 97. She's also Hungarian, so don't tell her I told you her age. And she's required 24-hour care for quite some time. And because I pay all of her bills, she doesn't qualify for anything, not from the claims conference, not from Medicaid.
So you're forced to use your own resources,
Right.
even when she is a survivor and she is entitled to payment. And
Right.
claims conference is holding money as trustee. They refuse to give it unless the survivor is living at the poverty line.
Yes.
Which is
How does that make any sense?
And in addition, what they'll give has not, even if my mother qualified, if I didn't pay her bills, my mother would qualify.
Well, what is
But
qualification?
even if she had below a certain amount of income and below a certain number of assets, I mean, not only do I pay her bills, but I bought her an apartment. Now, how many survivors have children that are able and willing to do this? My husband and I have been very lucky. My husband also is a doctor and also the son of survivors.
So you have two survivor parents,
right.
and both of them, you said you assisted them to apply for reparations.
Well, my father died when I was 10, so
right, okay.
no one assisted him.
But your mother and your father
Yes.
were in the process of applying. Your father passed away in the process of applying. And then, am I correct in saying that your mother was denied?
My mother there's two kinds of assistance that Germany gives and the Nazi governments. One kind is like a pension, disability pension, and the survivor gets themselves. That's what, and you had to prove injury. It wasn't enough that you were tortured
Right.
for years, okay? And so my father died. And then when my mother reapplied for him, I was still a little girl. I tried again and it was denied again. But so she got that for herself. But any other, so dealing directly with Germany, I have to say, as bureaucratic and Germanic as the system is, has been easier than dealing with any agency in the United States. I've been a survivor, a psychiatrist actually for
Right.
more than 40 years. And I dealt with all these agencies, and I've never seen anything like it.
Right.
I mean, I would
Well,
have to give up my
how about
job.
we're really short on time, so just
Yeah.
give us a little bit about the psychological effects. So, I mean, you have survivors coming here. They are proud people. They are people that completely rebuilt their lives, that literally lost almost the entirety of their family. And now they're coming, and they have American Jews who are in charge of the claims conference. I think there's, only one member of the board
Yes.
that's actually a Holocaust survivor
Right.
of the claims conference, I think. I mean, what kind of psychological effect does that have on them?
Well, my parents in particular, I can only speak, from personal experience really about this, never trusted the American Jewish community, and now I see for good reason.
And so how does it feel? I mean, what is your feeling when I show you a 990, which is a reporting, a document that the claims conference files every year, has to file as a not-for-profit, showing at the very minimum $300 million worth of net assets, and the fact that you can't even get the entirety of your dental bill paid for?
We accept that we are unable. We have we cannot do it. So we happy what we can receive. We don't have the power. We know we won't be able to fight this. So we're trying to see the little thing what we can get, and filling the forms and signing the papers and trying to learn what we can get. But we don't see the big picture, how much money they have.
Dr. Perry?
Well, I think you said something to me very telling a few days ago that, as survivors, we learn not to speak up. It's one of the survival mechanisms, having gotten them through the war. But Zahava had a husband who unfortunately had dementia and needed full-time help. And because she lives above the poverty line, which is not saying very much. I mean, the poverty line
Right.
for a single person in New York is $12,000 a year. That's quite a challenge. So that doesn't make her a rich person who can afford a 20-hour, $20 an hour home attendant. So she actually, did a lot of the work herself in her 80s and had some long-term care policy that she used to pay for his help. But that.
I mean, the fact that you even have to qualify to receive assistance from the claims conference or reparations for money.
One thing I wanted to say was they act, and people have mentioned this before, and I really thank you for doing this program. They act as if it's their money. Like, give me the money for the $20 an hour, 20 hours a week, and I'll supplement it because I can, and hire 24-hour help.
Well, that's the
They
whole
won't
point,
do that.
is that it is not their money to decide how to use, when to use, what kind of qualifications you have to put on someone, if you have to live at, beneath, or above, just slightly above the poverty line to qualify for assistance. The whole thing is just madness. Thank you so much, Naomi, Zahava, Dr. Paris, for coming on. We are incredibly grateful that you are willing to speak openly and truthfully about these subjects. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Charles Srebnik is a survivor of the Holocaust. No. Charles Srebnik, survivor, his family was burned in the Holocaust. Charles Srebnik is a survivor whose family was murdered in Auschwitz. He is 83 years old, and he is one of several directors of the Rockland Jewish Family Services, which provides health and medical services to the survivor community. He will be speaking in his personal capacity on Outspoken. Charles, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Let's get right to it. Please tell me about your work with Rockland Jewish Family Services, what they do, and if the needs of the survivor community are being met.
Fortunately, we're very happy that we have people like Dora Zuckerberg and Susan Connery who work with survivors in Rockland County and 4 other areas. They do a once-a-year person-to-person interview, talking to survivors on what they need and what they can help. On the other hand, they're limited in regards to funding on a lot of the things that we need. In Rockland County, we have 250 survivors, but 125 are serviced by the Jewish Family Service. And every year there's a need for more things. I made a list.
Yeah, tell me some of the needs that are not being met because the Rockland Jewish Family Service is simply not getting enough money.
Right. We need overnight funding for live-in homemade care, transportation, cleaning services, hospital and rehabilitation facilities, being able to help people with unexpected expenses like moving or minor home repairs, previous hearing aid and eyeglasses, dental care.
Yeah, this is a shame. I mean, and you help survivors apply for grants both from the German government and also from the Claims Conference. What has your experience been in applying for grants for the Claims Conference?
With the Claims Conference, we've been fairly successful in regards to specific funding that they've received from the German government. As an example, about 3 years ago, there was a special funding that was provided for survivors who were born between 1928 and 1945. Some of the people that I spoke to received funding. I applied myself. It took about 3.5 years.
Well, 3.5 years from the German government.
From the Claims Conference.
Oh, from the Claims Conference.
Right.
So you've had a better experience applying
directly
for
with the Germans.
reparations with the Germans.
Right, that's the Claims Conference.
Wow.
Because every time I call, they say, well, we're busy, we got so many people, and so blah, 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 blah.
So you're just getting the runaround.
Right, exactly.
And you are on the executive committee of the Holocaust Survivors Foundation.
Right.
How about the letter that they submitted to the New York Attorney General? How does it feel not to have any follow-up? Have you called the Attorney General's office?
For 5 years I have.
5 years? You've called, what, every year?
Every couple of weeks.
Every couple weeks.
Right. And Sam Dubbin, who is the head of our group, met with them once or twice, I think. And every time we came away from it was promises, promises, promises. Promises are nice.
So you're given the runaround.
Exactly.
And so if you had a member of the board of the Claims Conference who is sitting right here at this table, what would you say to them?
The first thing I would say is there's a need for new directors. There's only one Holocaust survivor on the board. He's 94 years old. I don't know how active he is, but he's a nice man. but the changing of philosophy at the claims conference has not changed. They try to keep as much money as they can in there. They're sitting with about a couple of $100 million. And my own personal analysis is they're building an annuity for their children.
So as a Holocaust survivor, the fact that they have hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank, that they're not spending it for Holocaust survivors that you personally see are in need of this list of basic medical supplies. How does that make you feel?
Terrible. Fortunately, as I say, we have two ladies who are very strong, who help survivors and go out of their way. They physically meet people once a year. They do an analysis of what is needed. And this is a very unusual group that we have in Rockland County.
Well,
We're very fortunate.
thank God for the Rockland Jewish Family Services and for you as well, Charles. Thank you so much for coming on. We're deeply appreciative.
Thank you.
Thank you. On every episode of Outspoken, I close the show by talking to my dad, Stormin Norman Goldstein, who's calling from Toronto. Dad, are you there?
Yes, I am. How are you?
Very good, thank you. So 3 questions for you. What was it like, as far as you remember, when your parents, who we call Bobby and Zadie, came to Canada as war refugees and survivors from Poland and Russia? Was it easy for them to assimilate in North America?
No, it wasn't very easy. There was huge language differences, and there was a huge cultural difference. But mostly the problem was that the domestic Jews didn't understand and appreciate what the survivors had went through. So the survivors learned not to talk about their experience except amongst themselves, and basically they went silent. The Canadian Jews were giving expressions like, that's the past, let bygones, be grateful and happy that you're in Canada. I mean, the Canadians were interested in sports and movies and pastimes that were given short shrift by the more serious survivers. Basically, they called the Canadians Yankee Doodles. They would make fun
they
of
just
them
didn't.
because
There was a
of their
cognitive.
shallowness.
There was a cognitive dissonance. They just couldn't relate to them. And what were Bobby and Zadie and their contemporaries? What was their attitude towards charity and reparations? I mean, weren't there organizations there to help them assimilate?
Well, there were organizations that helped them. They weren't overly helpful, but they did help them a little bit, especially in learning language and going for language classes. But basically, they were mostly on their own. They would get together, all of them, and talk about what to do, and they learned how to go and be scrappers and learn to start businesses or get some jobs.
So what's your whole take on the issue of the claims conference having such significant money in reserves while the basic needs of Holocaust survivors around the world are not being met?
Well, it's quite surprising that this group still has hundreds of millions of dollars available to them, and I would say that 80-90% of the Holocaust survivors have already passed on. And what are they going to be doing now with this money? Who's running these organizations? What is their goal?
Well, it's the very North American Jews that couldn't, I guess, relate to the Holocaust survivors. Thank you so much, Dad, for coming on, as always.
Well, it's very nice to be with you again. Thanks for inviting me.
On this episode of Outspoken, we spoke about an issue that is viewed as controversial by many, but which is really very cut and dry. Our survivor community must receive the financial assistance they need to live in dignity. The only thing that's controversial about this issue is that they are not receiving the care that they require, and that the main organization tasked with serving as the trustee for monies that are supposed to be used for survivor assistance is apparently not doing its job to the best of its abilities, is not distributing enough money to cover basic costs, and using money that is not theirs to fund other types of communal programs. The fact that so many survivors are currently living at or beneath the poverty line, while millions of dollars remain in the accounts of the claims conference, should be a pressing concern for the Jewish community as a whole, and an issue that we must be able to speak about openly and without any reservations. I remain incredibly disappointed that the claims conference refused to appear on the program and give the issue the respect it deserves through open and honest dialogue. In fact, I would argue that the Jewish community is entitled to hear from the Claims Conference, given that they operate as a trustee of survivor funds. They have an obligation to answer questions raised about the use of said funds by the survivors themselves, like Charles and Zahava, and all of Sam Dubbin's clients. Instead, the behavior of the Claims Conference demonstrates a dangerous arrogance and operates as a slap on the face of survivors who continue to ask the question, why aren't our basic needs for medicine, for housing, for home care being met? I am also taken aback at the fear and hesitation that I encountered when I approached community members and organizations and journalists about the issue. Some simply don't want to speak out, perhaps out of fear of either jeopardizing the grant monies they do currently receive, or being retaliated against, or causing intercommunal discord. I want to profoundly thank Sam, Naomi, Barbara, Charles, and Zahava for their willingness to speak about this important topic. And I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us on this episode of Outspoken. Until next time, and remember, enforce your rights, cherish your heritage, and be outspoken in your defense of the truth.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.